All right. Welcome back to our second Gatty lecture of this semester. Let's now welcome Sarah Miners, PhD candidate from the History Department, to introduce Emmy Donald.
Hello, everyone. I am very, very happy to be introducing Emmy today. We arrived at Cornell together many years ago, in a year I will not actually mention because it was a very long time ago. But I am just like thrilled to have watched and hung out with Emmy as we've both gone through this process and to hear sort of the culmination of the work they've been doing. So Emmy Donald is a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Cornell. Their dissertation traces the historical foundations of Thailand's contemporary LGBTQ+ movement from the perspective of thom, women-loving women feminists, and trans men. Donald also writes and teaches on topics related to colonial and nationalist regimes of gender and sexuality, social movements in Asia, and public history in the Global South. Today, their talk is titled Bodies That Unbind, Producing Tomboy and Transgender Knowledge in Thailand. Please join me in welcoming Emmy.
Hello. Hello. Can everybody hear me? Oh, that's good. That's good. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that very kind introduction. I think we should all take a deep breath and lower our expectations. Just a little bit. No, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Lee Jun and Chintong, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be back in this room, a very special place. It is quite frightening to be on this side of the thing for once, and it might only happen once. So we're gonna determined to have a good time. Yes, as Sarah said, it's a dissertation chapter that I'm working on that I'll be presenting today, work in progress. The chapter is about how the concept of tomboy, known as thom in Thai, and that of transman came to be understood as distinct bodies of knowledge that signify different ways of knowing and inhabiting the body, roughly since the 2010s, right? Here are some key terms that I'll be using. Thom, from the English tomboy, originated sort of through Thai print media from the 1950s, but didn't really become widely recognizable until the late 1970s. Trans is the English word trans, short for transgender. It's often transliterated directly into Thai as trans. And the terms for transgender are usually sort of based around this idea of khamped. So gan khamped is transgender, kon khamped, transgender person, ผู้หญิง khamped, transgender woman, ผู้ชาย khamped, transgender man. The kham is the cross, pad being the Thai word sort of collectively to refer to sex, gender, and sexuality. The term Gatty is also very relevant here. It's a really important Thai Khmer concept. Historically denotes, as many of you probably know, either a combination of or a kind of movement between the positions of woman and man, male and female. Gatty is used it's used to mean many different things, very complex, but activists and scholars writing today in both Thai and English often use it somewhat interchangeably with transgender woman. But what I want to talk through, those are the terms that we're kind of working with. What I want to do first, though, is talk about this. January 23rd, 2025 was the first official day of marriage equality in Thailand. Yay! And these scenes of people gathering to register their marriage and these big collective celebrations, incredibly joyous. I'm still recovering emotionally from seeing so many people that I had the privilege of meeting in the fields, taking this step together at the same time. It's very exciting. Some Thai news outlets called it D-Day, like D-Day meaning kind of like execute the plan, like let's do this. But also D, I like it because D is like good in Thai, so it's like good day. There's a lot to say about this moment. I was really struck personally by seeing so many people having such kind of joyous interactions with state bureaucracy. I think, like, I think as things started just deteriorating more and more in the US, it's quite surreal to see people having this affirming interaction with the state, right? But there's a lot to say too about the activism that led up to this moment, which is kind of driving a lot of my research and interests right now. I'll just say the organization Bangkok Pride, it came out with this graphic that tells us that in the first 2 days of legal marriage equality, 23rd and 24th of January, a total of 4,497 couples were registered across the country. All of these couples, sorry, this graphic estimates that 2,567 were same-sex couples, chai-chai couples, yin-yin couples. The remaining, whatever, big number of these couples, do the math before the talk. They were later described as like man-woman couples or chai-yin couples. And it caused a bit of a stir among Thai LGBTQ communities online, as people sort of asking why there were no statistics immediately available about transgender and non-binary people registering their marriages as part of these big collective celebrations. And I bring this up because I think it highlights how trans people are increasingly seen as very central to the broader Thai LGBTQ plus movement, such that the absence of this kind of data was very conspicuous for many folks online. And the English language terms like trans, transgender, even the Thai terms kamphet are not household names, right? They don't have that kind of knowability yet, perhaps. They are becoming more and more recognizable, primarily among urban middle-class youth, but not as exclusively as we might expect. And I know this slide is very overwhelming, but the thing that I wanted to point out is that since 2022, there have been these huge annual Pride festivals that often that come with a lot of elements of trans pride as well. And these have taken place with quite strong intergenerational representation in provincial cities across the country, kind of stretching beyond Bangkok's gravitational pull a little bit. They're certainly still within its sphere of influence, of course, to some degree. But so I think while like young middle class Bangkokians are certainly remain the drivers really of these discourses, I think it's no longer possible to claim that these ideas aren't used and made meaningful beyond those demographic classifications, which are a little bit murky anyway. But it might even make sense to claim, as I would like to, that there is a specifically transgender movement underway in Thailand, which has been taking shape in more and more explicit ways since the 2010s. And part of what I want to argue here is that the relationship between thom and transman can really help to shed further light, I think, on the development of that movement. Yeah, and that if we're going to be able to talk about trans history, in sort of more expansive terms, or a little bit like deeper than's been done already, and especially the unexplored history of trans men, transgender men, trans masculinities, we need to also talk about thom and thom embodiment, thom knowledge, and the history of that concept. So I'll be going back to this point a little later. Here's the general plan for the rest of the talk. The chapter has 4 sections, beginning with, it begins with a discussion of how thomness gets invoked within trans life narratives and some background on the development of these contemporary terms. And then I sort of go back to the history of Bangpayat, or sex change, as one potential way to historicize contemporary Thai transgender knowledge. And this is followed by some more examples of like thom and transman, like how they sort of commingle in trans men's cultural knowledge production during the 2010s. And the 5th section is my attempt to step back and say a little bit more about the bigger project and how it all fits in together. My dissertation currently called Bodies That Scatter, but in a good way, kind of. So I'll start here. During the 2024 Bangkok Pride Festival, the Bangkok Arts and Cultural Center held a photography exhibition titled Pride Families, and it featured the portraits and personal testimonies of 7 LGBTQ plus individuals, one of which was titled I Am a Trans Man, and it was the portrait and story of a trans man named Mai. So raised in a Muslim family in Thailand's south, Mai's account of his life up to that point invokes two distinct phases: a troubled past spent living as Thom or tomboy, and an optimistic future living as a trans man. Bringing these two stages of experience and self-definition, bridging these two stages of self-definition was Mai's decision to transition medically and socially, right? Mai described his transition effectively sort of opened up new bonds of connection within his family. And the capacity, I think, for transition to actually bring one closer to one's immediate family presents a bit of a stark line of comparison, maybe, with some of the transgender life stories that we might encounter here in North America and the global North, more generally, where transgender bodies, past and present, are so thoroughly politicized, and with institutions casting this kind of cruel and invasive scrutiny over trans people's rights to work and study and simply exist as trans, and where trans embodiment becomes this like existential threat to the family and the state. In parts of Southeast Asia, too, contemporary political rhetoric and the legacies of colonial legal systems often target sexual and gender diversities as potentially corrupting forces that threaten social order, religious morality, and so-called Asian values, right? But Mai's narrative prompts the consideration of transness in general and medical gender transition in particular as that which can constitute more of a binding social force, perhaps. Potentially enabling an alignment of the body and the self with the external social world rather than in opposition to it. So Mai described that he knew himself to be a man ever since he can remember. He recounts that as a teenager, before learning about Gankamhet, he defined himself as Thom, which his parents could not accept. His father in particular believed that being Thom, or someone who is Petisam, or third sex gender, constituted a sin against Islam. And after a difficult youth, Mai eventually did learn about Gan Khamphet, and he writes about learning about Gan Khamphet in 2014. He gathered all the information he could, and then he decided that he was not in fact Thom, he was a trans man. And though he worried about whether his family would accept him as such, Mai explained that, quote, "I was so uncomfortable, I couldn't stay in that body. I couldn't go on being Thom any longer," end quote. He started hormone therapy and pursued top surgery. And when Mai shared the news about his transition with family, he was surprised that his father offered an affirming response, accepting Mai as his son. And Mai then attests to how this sort of love and acceptance of his family is one of the most important parts of his life. Just to go back to this portrait here again, self-portrait photograph that Mai submitted to the exhibition. It shows him standing up straight, eyes fixed ahead, as an older man who is his father. His father carefully trims the edges of Mai's fringe. An intergenerational act of care and a quiet bond between father and son. The arrangement of both men who come to the scene with this shared understanding of how to style and care for the masculine body recalls the notion of masculinities as, quote, individual, practical, daily accomplishments, right? Often introduced and sustained through familial relationships. Mai's narrative of self-discovery follows certain familiar tropes, perhaps for accounts of transgender identity that we hear about today a little bit. Trans studies scholars have shown how the development of sexology, medicalization of sex and gender from the 19th century onwards, established a kind of diagnostic model of transness, one premised on what Julianne Fisher terms trans autobiographical mandate. And this model dictates that those seeking affirmative care and recognition must offer a linear transition narrative, right? One that reveals a coherent trans subject at the core of the story, and thereby absolves any aleatory chaos of life experience, as one scholar puts it, or as I would say, absolves the kind of scatter between identity terms and sort of modern different modes of embodiment. And here's just another portrait of Mai that appeared in a different photo exhibition in Bangkok in 2022 as part of a kind of talking about trans men's embodiment and experiences. His narrative began in childhood, right? It follows these kind of perhaps linear tropes in that it began in childhood. Then the story then moves through a comfortable intermediate phase before he finally gained access to transgender knowledge and began a process of transition. While scholars argue that this kind of normative sequencing of life events, like normative and stages, can sort of reproduce teleological notions, that there is a singular, correct way to know oneself and to be known as transgender, my story also conveyed important details about the development of transness in Thailand in particular. My posited transness, Kahin, as this deeply relational body of knowledge that rather than fracturing and disrupting his social world, actually brought him closer to it. And crucial to his narrative, too, is the invocation of thomness. So Mai's troubled adolescence spent living as Thom was effectively reappraised to some degree through this process of transition. Thomness, in Mai's narrative, arrives as something distinct from, but also somehow prior to, and altogether less livable for Mai than transgender, trans man. And so I'm taking Mai's story, some of the cues from it, as an entry point to think about these questions. How did thom and trans come to constitute such distinct bodies of knowledge? What kinds of knowledge production created and sustained those distinctions? And what might be at stake in the unbinding of thom and trans bodies? And I'm setting out to argue, right, first that the emergence and circulation, specifically of trans and Gankampeat knowledge in the 2010s onwards, brought about significant changes to the status and social understanding of thom. Its previously nebulous meanings, which I'll discuss more in a little bit, became more tightly constricted a little bit more tightly bound through and against that of trans man. And at the same time, this invocation of a thom past came to provide some conditions for transgender futures. And that's what I describe as this kind of unbinding relationship between thom and trans man, and that these two distinct bodies of knowledge are pried apart even as they travel together and are conjured within life stories as different modes of knowing and inhabiting the body. And the second part of this is a broader level, sort of arguing that the concept of thom is really quite critical for analyzing the history of the Thai LGBTQ plus movement in general, but also development of Thai transgender politics in particular. And I should clarify, now that I'm claiming this kind of like Thai trans knowledge discourses constitute relatively new forms of knowledge, but of course there's nothing new, right, about people crossing or transing gender, to borrow a term from historian Jen Mannion, to transgender, right? It's important to state this explicitly because of how the claim that transgender identities are new and inherently modern has become weaponized in contemporary political ideologies, particularly here in Anglo-North America. As scholar Colby Gordon points out in his work on early modern trans theology, quote, the assumption that trans life is a specifically modern phenomenon in contrast to the apparently timeless stability of cisgender, meaning non-transgender, modes of identity and embodiment, has been foundational to the lethal politics of trans antagonism in the present moment. So early modernists, such as Gordon, put forward powerful arguments that transness in the past, in the deep past even, was not simply a matter of clothing or eccentric fantasies, but that, quote, transition happened, both socially and surgically, end quote. And that comprehending the significance of such histories requires a careful reading of how the available categories shift and scatter and kind of break apart and reform, right? A scholarship that we're probably all familiar with from Michael Pellitz and Peter Jackson and others makes very clear that Southeast Asia, with these deep and diverse historical traditions of gender transing, is a rich site for this kind of work. And so my intentions for the chapter then is not to ignore these regional traditions, but to describe how in the early 21st century, the ideas of Kankampeet or trans became useful in a different way, in a new way, kind of, to gender diverse people in Thailand. And the coining and popularization of the Thai term Kankampeet is usually attributed to scholar Prem Prida Pramod Ayutthaya, who used Kampeet in her 2006 book, Yewati, which is an ethnographic and theoretical analysis of trans Gathai social status and representation in Thai society. Kampeet is now widely used in Thai scholarship, as I've mentioned, and also activism. And locating this Thai trans discourse as recently emerging, as I've been saying, is not about ignoring deep histories and theorizations of gender diversity in the region, but about highlighting the development of Gan Kamphet as a new way of knowing the body that was not widely available in Thailand or anywhere else for that, really most anywhere else for that matter, until the late 90s and the 2000s. It's also about exploring how such ideas impacted existing theories of sex, gender, and sexual diversity, particularly thomness. So to get a sense of what I've been alluding to of this diverse and kind of wide-ranging understandings of thom prior to the 2010s, it's helpful to turn to Megan Sinnott's 2004 ethnography, Thoms and Ds. D, by the way, comes from the English lady, and it's used by or in reference to women who have relationships with thom. And Sinnott demonstrates that in the 90s and the early 2000s, when she was doing this work, thom, embodiment, and self-knowledge drew strategically from the status of woman and man, but was effectively reducible to neither. And I really love that this one interlocutor describes thom as being akin to being a turtle, like being able to see both the water and the land. I love turtles. Anyway, so some of Sinnott's interlocutors also describe their thomness as a particular kind of manhood, klamben pushai, but one that could fluctuate, right, depending on deeply contextualized and deeply relational, depending on what kind of relationships they were in. Through the consolidation of transman, however, thom is kind of reworked to primarily, almost exclusively, denote women who dress like men, but who do not desire to change their bodies through hormones or surgery. And to further understand this kind of development of this knowledge and how trans knowledge kind of hinges so firmly on the body and its capacities for change, it kind of got me looking at sex change, blank payat discourses, specifically with regards to people assigned female at birth. So Thailand's status, right, as this global center for non-Thais seeking gender reassignment surgery, or GRS, and other forms of gender-affirming care is very well established, right? Aren Aizura points out that in the context of Thailand's expansive medical tourism market, gender reassignment surgery marketed towards non-Thais might be regarded as the earliest medical travel niche market in Thailand, and a model for the hugely profitable medical travel industry generally. The internal or domestically focused development of GRS in Thailand is a little bit less well known. And by most accounts, the first sex change or blank payat operation performed in Thailand was a male to female M to F gender reassignment procedure. So I'm going to be using these terms like M to F, male to female, female to male, F to M. I might get them confused. I struggle with it for some reason. Gender reassignment procedure that was conducted in 1975 is kind of marking the first moment. 1975, conducted at Chulalongkorn University Hospital. Recent investigations, however, into this periodization reveal a more complicated timeline. And here I'm drawing on emerging work by Janette Esther Suvarnanon, who's currently a doctoral student at the University of Victoria, who demonstrates that privileging this 1975 kind of moment as the beginning of GRS in Thailand could actually obscure an earlier period of experimentation when doctors and medical professionals first set out to study and classify Katili kind of along the lines of medical pathology. Shanatip analyzes the case of two Thai doctors who conducted medical studies on Katili patients and prisoners in the 1950s, and they published some of this in the Journal of the Medical Association of Thailand in the 60s. Shanatip's work, which I encourage everyone to read and follow, is fantastic, locates this like deeper, more nuanced timeline of GRS with evidence suggesting that the first experimental forays by the Thai medical establishment into sex change procedures likely date back to at least the 1950s. And corroborating with Master's research by Tusak Romchumpa, Shanatip also shows that female to male sex change procedures were similarly already being practiced before the conventional starting point, 1975. The first recorded F to M, female to male, surgery in Thailand, according to archival evidence brought to light by these two scholars, was performed between was several procedures, actually, right? It was performed between 1972 and 1973 at Bangkok's Central Hospital. And news of the surgery was covered in the daily newspaper, Thai Rat, in 1972, with the headline, Thai physicians successfully change sex of young female college student. And I'm going to be discussing some, pretty classic kind of disparaging misgendering that's fairly typical of these vernacular press coverage. So heads up for that. The Thai Rat article described the person at the center of this story using the pseudonym Warapon, but they also used like Nang Sao as just to indicate this person. They essentially call this person Ms. Warapon, right? Nang Sao being the term for young unmarried woman, while also emphasizing his masculine qualities at the same time. This article stated that the person in question has a slender figure, a face much like a man, short cropped hair, and uses the word thom, masculine coded I pronoun in Thai. So in choosing this kind of specifically feminized terms of address, but also emphasizing Warapon's like masculinity, manliness, the news coverage produced this very disjointed picture of someone caught kind of momentarily between, I guess, two statuses, like a woman on paper and a man in body and speech. But it's also worth noting that the Thai Rat article, as well as contemporaneous coverage of the case that I've found, it didn't use words like thom, which wasn't in wide circulation at this time anyway. It didn't use words like gatty either in the description of Warapon, which might suggest that blank payet, or sex change, was understood not as something that transformed a non-normative body into a normative body, as was the stated goal of North American sex gender surgeries from the mid-20th century onwards. But instead, it was a process that changed one normative body, female body, into another normative body, a male body. Some of these dynamics indicate for me that blank payet discourses are closely related to the development of contemporary Thai trans knowledge in some ways, and also the processes of demarcating thomness from transness, or even sometimes gattiness from transness, in that it's possible to see how differentiations between these kind of different ideas of the body and what the body, what putting the body through changes, what that produces, were already kind of being mapped out in these, albeit pretty rare, mainstream discussions of blank payet in the 1970s. So it's really not until the 2000s, right, when such discussions become more explicit and more public. For some additional background, the 1980s and 1990s, as folks probably know, marked the founding of several important groups and public movements that advocated for gender and sexual minorities using the language of human rights, and particularly around issues related to healthcare. Among these organizations, of course, the Anjari group, Anjari, which advocated publicly for the rights of Thom D and women-loving women, Yingak Ying. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, these activist networks assembled these kind of policy-driven campaigns, such as aims at like getting the Thai Ministry of Health to remove homosexuality from the list of mental disorders, which succeeded in 2002. And by the mid-2000s, then Thailand, but specifically Bangkok, right? Specifically, Bangkok was firmly established as this global center for gender-affirming care, as well as HIV and AIDS prevention, gay print cultures and tourism, activism, and the production of academic scholarship on LGBTQ+ issues in Asia, really. So much like transgender knowledge in North America and elsewhere, this like Thai Gangkhamhet transgender discourses were formulated out of this dynamic conjuncture, right, of various forces, including healthcare, community advocacy, academic, activist networks, global market and digital flows, and civil society organizing as well. And I just want to point out, I guess, like, it's important to think about this in relation to Thai trans women and Gattai people as well. Like, trans women and Gattai people, activists and celebrities have long held very prominent sort of public positions in activisms, you know, the 80s and 90s. Gattai and trans women also bear the majority of public scrutiny and stigma within mainstream media, past and present. And trans men, trans masculine people, as well as thom, are notably less scrutinized generally, also less visible historically, which is something we can talk about later. But in the 2010s, trans men started to gain this increasing public recognition, largely via digital media, social media, and through the actions of several outspoken individuals. So in 2012, for instance, there was this online group that formed called the Transman Alliance of Thailand, or TMAT. It's still active today, and it represents this really important space, actually, for the fermentation of knowledge and vocabularies around transmasculinity. It's probably the main source of like transmas gossip and celebrity gossip and news and resource sharing related to gender affirming healthcare services. So this page was founded 2012 by one of these people, Kuripat Chotitan Nitsakun, who also goes by Jimmy. Is an entertainment producer, author, and activist turned celebrity. Kuripat, along with Parit Chomchun, were the first two Thai men to share their stories publicly in the kind of mainstream media and online. They appeared together in this feature article from the Bangkok Post, also in 2012. And though both men went public with their experiences of transition at about the same time, they used their platforms quite differently. Kuripat became a popular celebrity, while Parit pursued this long-term career in human rights and environmental activism. And for most of the 2010s, right, Kuripat was like a pop culture idol kind of figure. It appeared on talk shows, gave a lot of interviews in Thai and English outlets, and also administered this TMAT group, this TMAT community. Much of the mainstream coverage of Kuripat's story, it reads as fairly exploitative and voyeuristic in the kind of classic ways very typical of Thai tabloids, right? Which primarily used Kuripat's experiences as this way to produce like salacious articles that purport to take you inside someone's like private life. But Kuripat also used his platform to share his own perspectives, his own theories about transness, and the central message being that transness hinged on the physical body, and that it was firmly distinguishable from thomness. In an interview in 2013, for instance, Kuripat stated that, quote, "Ever since I can remember, right when I was born, I've known that I'm a man. And ever since I came to be in this body, that I've known that. And I certainly don't like being called Tom," right? Here, Kuripat is locating his transness in similar temporal terms as Mai did about a decade later, is originating in childhood. His self-knowledge as a man is ever present in his body. And in his appearances on popular Thai talk show, he appeared in a popular Thai talk show, in 2014, and he defined transness, puchai khampet, in the following terms. Being a trans man, to put it simply, means being assigned as a woman who receives sex change surgery to become a man in full. It starts with taking hormones. The voice is the first thing to change. Then comes the mustache, facial hair, leg hair, and then chest surgery. And lastly, a sex change, which means bottom surgery in this context, right, to become a complete man. And he continues that even though my body chose the form it wanted to take, when it comes to love, there's not really a choice. I tried to date a man once because my family wanted me to have a boyfriend. So I took a swing at it. And in the end, it was impossible. I saw him as a friend, and that's how I confirmed to myself that I've been a man all along. So Kuripat here actually located the body as this key incubator for transness. He also emphasized external relational factors as being very critical to his own self-discovery. As one of the earliest public accounts of its kind in Thai, it contributed significantly to the establishment of the understanding of trans man as a site of bodily change, as well as explicit heterosexuality in many cases. So this definition effectively helped, I think, extricate trans man away from potential associations with thomness, given that thom is more commonly associated to denote kind of homosexual position or same-sex sexuality, right? And so thom becomes a little more tightly bound to the status of like woman and also to the status of homosexuality or same-sex sexuality. Still, both thom and transman are positions that are assumed to convey the sexual attraction and romantic desires towards women. And as such, the two systems of knowledge kind of shared the few very limited cultural and social spaces that were available for expressing this kind of sexuality. In 2013, Gatty appeared on the cover of At Thom Act. It's like a very glossy Thai magazine that ran from 2007 to 2019, and it's centered on fashion, gossip, lifestyle, Tom D romances in Thailand and internationally. And with limited discursive and sort of physical spaces available, this formation of this transmasculine community, I think this appearance at Thom Act is important because for how it conveys how these Thom-centered spaces offered some supporting infrastructure and resources for founding the founding and also circulating this kind of knowledge. Coming on the heels of Guripat's rise to celebrity, Thai trans men activists and thinkers in the mid 2010s went on to produce quite a lot of literature in the form of like memoirs and guidebooks about the transition process. Very, very candid stories, very transparent material. Most recently, they've some of these networks have produced there's a children's book now. There's also this board game, which is very fun, FTM's Journey. It's a lot of fun. It's very competitive, actually. Guripat himself also authored a two-part series on like the beginner's guide to transgender men on topics of surgery and hormones. And there are at least like 3 or 4 other memoirs that I know about that detail particular individuals' experiences and through medical transition. I think this is a pretty important publication within this movement of like cultural production. It's a short guidebook first published by activists in 2015. Has this hybrid Thai English title, like Becoming Me Men, the Becoming Men, the not so secret story of thom and trans man. And the book centers around a core narrative that's acted out in the style of like a comic book with these silhouetted figures and speech bubbles. And it follows a single person account, right? A quite linear account of trans self-discovery. It's collaborative, it's kind of semi-autobiographical, like the amalgamation of lots of stories in one story. And the idea of thom is invoked throughout the story. In one instance, the main character described how while his female friends were experiencing puberty, becoming more and more feminine, he felt himself going in the opposite direction, becoming more and more comfortable, knowing himself as a man. But his family, quote, they were all scared I was going to turn out to be thom. So he had to sort of pretend had to pretend to be a woman for a while. But later, as a young adult, the narrator sort of accounts for this unwavering commitment to this not yet knowable position of like pushai compared to trans man. Without the precise term at hand, the narrator states that no matter who tried to tell him that he's really a thom, he remains certain that he has always been this way ever since I was born. And I'm quoting here again. People come up to me and ask if I'm thom, and I turn to them and I say, no, I'm not. If you really want to know, just look and see for yourself. So this speaks, I think, to the significant importance placed on like bringing the body into relation with what's around you, having it be legible in a certain way in the external social world, but also rather than telling someone in bounded terms, rather than saying an identity category out loud or how they should refer to you or what pronouns, right? The central character effectively calls others to like just witness my body, how I act, how I comport myself, that kind of materiality. But interestingly, there's like a second English language version of this book, comes out in 2018, and the narrative remains the same pretty much, but several other sections are like added in the back, including a section on the differences between thom and trans man, all in English. And these differences, the chapter stated, quote, have been discussed ever since the word trans man was introduced in Thailand. And the text continues by offering this distinction. The two carry very different meanings, even though some would feel they are very similar. For toms, also known as butch lesbians, the term is used to refer to women who appear very masculine, and it is a well-known term within Thai society. They identify as and are satisfied with being female and do not wish to surgically or hormonally alter their bodies to be more masculine. For transgender men, the key difference is that they identify as men, and so many who want to change their bodies to match their identity. So this passage is kind of explicitly linking Tom actually with this Anglo-North American term, concept of butch lesbian, a comparison that's made it's made more and more often today, actually, but it doesn't appear in much Thai language material prior to, probably the last 5 years. And it rarely, if ever, is present in like Thai language discourses. So this term is not used in the Thai version of this guidebook. Selecting the comparison probably makes Tom a bit more legible internationally, transnationally. And describing Tom is like satisfied with being women, trans men are positioned or defined largely through their desires and needs to change that, right? That's the kicker. But there could of course be many reasons like as to why activists, the activist editors of the book chose to add and omit certain details when reformulating it into English. The English version is likely intended for a very different audience, very different purpose. It's less about sharing resources within Thai-speaking communities, more about contributing to sort of transnational knowledge production around trans issues, putting up sort of Thai civil society organizations as being very literate in these topics. And another way of reading the differences between this 2015, 2018 edition is that the paradigms and terminologies that we're dealing with, they transform so incredibly quickly. In the 3 years, in this 3-year gap, it had become a bit controversial and perhaps simply incongruous to explicitly link Tom and transman as two parts of a shared story. And in situating Tomness as something uncomfortable that one experiences in childhood, I think I'm sort of reading it as like producing a past body and a future body, right? Like they're tied to one another. They're not necessarily through direct lineage or as a kind of like transmasculine continuum, but through the production of narratives that rely on past Tom bodies to give way to future trans ones. And in thinking through what all this material is doing, what it might mean, I often return to this thought that it's not all that unusual, right? It's not that unusual necessarily. In the present moment here in the US and in Australia, where I'm from, I've noticed this kind of a surprising amount of discussion happening about tomboy as a gendered term with specifically female connotations. It's a specific like phase of girlhood, perhaps. And it's happening from these areas of kind of anti-trans antagonism, a little bit exclusionary, wanting to like reclaim tomboy as like just because you're a tomboy doesn't mean you'll grow up to be trans, right? And this is normal, quote unquote, as opposed to whatever. But the difference here is that in the Thai case, it's kind of reversed. So this discussion gets turned around. And Thai Tomness does not easily or universally equate to womanhood or manhood, nor does it exclusively adhere like all the time to masculinity and femininity. And in the Thai case, it's trans men who find it necessary to make this distinction, to distinguish themselves from Tom, because Tom is often much more variable, unpredictable, and I think quite scattered, more so than these contemporary knowledge systems of sex and gender, more so than they can explain always. And that's kind of where the scatter space comes in. Knowledge production, right? By and for Thai trans men since the 2010s, gave material and theoretical shape to the idea that Tomness and transness occupy these distinct social territories. The former defined as a masculine expressing female body, and the latter by embodied manhood and the body's capacity for changes. As thoroughly as these two bodies are distinct from one another, this idea of like trans futures getting narrativized, like put into discourse through the invocation of Tom pasts, I think is quite important. And making sure that sort of we can think of both as quite meaningful bodies of knowledge for how they co-constitute each other. to situate this within my dissertation somehow, this chapter contributes, the last piece of a kind of bigger, of a bigger project that seeks to map out this historical arc from kind of the 1950s to the present of how we get to trans, like how we get to marriage equality, to a specifically transgender movement taking place in Thailand, and how we get to Ganhampet knowledge specifically. And Thai histories of gender and sexual diversity, as I tend to read them, typically seem to coalesce around these two ends of a wide spectrum, right? They have the kind of pre-modern, early modern traditions of gender transing as modes of ritual and ceremony, ancestral communication on one end, and then this hyper-modern, economically driven, globalized, hybridized gender and sexual identity politics on the other. But understanding, I think, how we get to trans in the present, I think it requires taking a closer look at the categories that develop somewhere in the middle of these two paradigms. Considering thom as a historical category asks us to meander a little bit, I think, in the middle, in this kind of scattered middle space where old and new theories of self collide, where established and emerging ways of knowing the body mingle and shape one another. And so my dissertation, this is all going to change, but you get the idea. It makes two contributions, I think, I hope, I don't know. First, it's figuring out how we might historicize sex, gender, and sexual transgressions among people assigned female at birth, and how we can highlight the significant roles that thom, bi, and ying played in fermenting and securing the conditions for things like marriage equality, but also for trans knowledge, like how it's kind of connected in some way. Second, it's about tracing thom as this theory of embodiment that can tell us something new, I think, about the scattered middle between traditionally revered ritualized practices and contemporary politics of identity. Bodies that scatter, pretty shameless Judith Butler ripoff, is my way of describing a historical process from the 50s to the present that brings us to trans modes of knowing and inhabiting the body. And the stories that trans men tell about themselves here, like as we've seen, they're often very coherent. They highlight a clear pathway from one point to the next, but they also describe a certain scatter phase, living as thom, being perceived as thom, as if one has to go through thom to get to trans. And taking a cue from them, I'm hoping to show, that thomness exists in the present as this important reminder that our contemporary identity categories, the ones that we seem to know so well, that seem so discrete and definitive, are founded on this actually quite deep and profound, like, scatter space. Okay, so a huge thank you to these folks for their help, and for all of you for listening. And that's my time. No further questions.